Hello everyone, and welcome to the final canto of Dante's Inferno. And because we are jumping over so much of the Inferno, unfortunately, I want to go ahead and give you a brief recap of what we've done so far, as well as the parts that we're skipping over, just to give you an idea of exactly the journey that Dante goes through, because we're going to pick up with him towards the end of this journey through the Inferno. So you'll remember that in Canto 1, we began with Dante in the Dark Woods, otherwise known as the Defile. And this is where he meets Virgil, and they finally go on their journey together. They begin to descend into hell. But before doing so, we meet them in Canto 3, and here we see that they have come to the Anti-Inferno. So reserved for those people who were not good enough to enter into heaven, but also not evil enough or wicked enough to find themselves in hell. After that, we passed over that first circle where Virgil himself resides, and we came to the second circle in Canto 5, and that's the circle reserved for those guilty of the sin of lust. Remember, that's where we found Francesca and Paolo, our two ill-fated lovers. And now, in today's video, we're going to begin with Canto 34, and finding ourselves in that final circle, that circle reserved for treacherous people, so those who betray the trust of others. So just to give you a brief recap of what happens then in circles 3 through 8, Dante is progressively going deeper into these layers of hell. And as he gets deeper, the sins that are committed become more complex and more wicked according to Dante's view. So for example, in circle 3, you have those who are guilty of the sin of gluttony. So those who eat more than they need, who drink more than they need. Then we work our way through greed and anger until we come to those more deeper, complex, and wicked sins, such as heresy, for example. So saying things that go against the church, that go against God. Circle of violence. And here, interestingly, we also see sub-circles introduced into hell. So the circle of violence is not just everyone on one level, but depending upon the type of violence that you commit, you find yourself deeper into hell. The same is said in circle 8, that circle of fraud. So depending upon what type of fraud you committed and who the fraud was against, you find yourself in a lower place in hell. Remember, the lower you get, the worse it gets. And then finally today, we're going to find ourselves in the lowest circle of hell. And here is where we're going to meet the king of hell, Lucifer. So, speaking of Lucifer, as we get into this, for those of you who are fans of the Lucifer series on Netflix, like I am, unfortunately, this is not the type of Lucifer we are talking about. So he is not a handsome British man. So get that image out of your head now. When we talk about Dante in terms of Lucifer, we're talking about a creature who, yes, was once beautiful, but now he is wicked, disfigured, horrible to look at, and deeply, intensely terrifying. Yeah. So if you are a fan of the show, think about the devil's face that Lucifer's character talks about, and then times it by 100. And that is the type of fear-inducing image that Dante wants us to think of. And again, we also have our focus question. So as we begin to dive into Canto number 34, we're looking at how hell is described, but also how Lucifer is described. So in this video, we're just going to look at the first 30 lines in Canto 34. You can find them on page 753 to page 754 of your literature book. And now, vexilla reges prodeunt inferni. Therefore, look, my master said, as we continued on the long descent, and see if you can make him out, ahead. As though, in the exhalation of heavy mist, or while night darkened our hemisphere, one spied a mill, blades turning in the wind, half lost off in the distance. Some structure of that kind I seemed to make out now, but at a gust of wind, there being no other shelter at hand, I drew behind my leader's back again. By now, in putting it in verse, I find fear in myself still. I had journeyed down to where the shades were covered wholly by ice, showing like straw and glass, some lying prone, and some erect, some with the head towards us, and others with the bottoms of the feet, another like a bow, bent feet to face. When we had traveled forward to the spot from which it pleased my master to have me see that creature whose beauty once had been so great, he made me stop and moved from in front of me. Look, here is Dis, he said, and here is the place where you must arm yourself with the quality of fortitude. How chilled and faint I was on hearing that. You must not ask me, reader. I do not write it. Words would not suffice. I neither died nor kept alive. Consider with your own wits what I, alike denuded of death and life, became as I heard my leader. So we're beginning Canto 34 then, surprisingly, with this line of Latin, because remember, when we talked about the way in which Dante the poet wrote the Divine Comedy, we said that he particularly disregarded the use of Latin and instead used the vernacular, so the common Italian tongue. And here, Dante is making an allusion, so not illusion with an I, but allusion with an A, meaning a reference to something outside of the text. And here specifically, he's referencing a particular Christian hymn that was famous and well known in his time, and is translated as this welcoming of the King of Heaven. Look at how his banner waves in and resides. But you'll notice that we already have an idea of what the word heaven might be in Latin. Remember, Italian is very similar to Latin in respect to the way the words sound. And in Italian, we know that the word for heaven is paradiso. But we notice here the word paradiso is not used. Instead, the word inferni is used. What does this sound like? If you're thinking in your head inferno, you're absolutely right. So here it's not praising the banner of the King of Heaven, but rather praising the banner of the King of Hell, being Lucifer. And this is going to be interesting because we've talked about how Dante has been on this long downward descent. Yeah, descent meaning to go down. And this stands in complete contrast to his trying to ascend that mountain in Canto 1. So we've known this whole entire time Dante is walking away from heaven, his ultimate goal, and has had to walk through hell to get there first. So here the first thing we notice is that this twist on this classic Christian hymn is a mocking, right, of God, of heaven. And again, this makes sense because hell is completely devoid of the presence of God. And if God is not present then in hell, who is? The king of hell, Lucifer. We also understand then that this has been a long journey for Dante. And he's finally going to find himself face to face with the last creature that he's going to have to come across in hell before he is able to find himself in purgatory and one step closer to paradise. And so when we see Virgil talking, or continuing to speak to Dante here, and he says, see if you can make him out ahead. He's talking about Lucifer. So look, Dante, into that far distance and see, can you see the devil? Do you see him there? And again, we see that Dante is going to make use of simile, so making this comparison. And the comparison then that he is making is him looking out into this distance, trying to make out the figure of Lucifer, is like one who is trying to look out across this sea of heavy mist or fog. And not only doing so with being unable to see because of the mist, but also being unable to see clearly because of the darkness that surrounds them. So we're beginning to become closer to that moment where we finally meet Lucifer. But just like Dante the Pilgrim and Dante the Poet, we don't have a clear image of what he looks like yet. We see then in this third tercet that his comparison continues, that he begins to see this structure through the mist and through the darkness. And it's almost like this big mill. So think of a windmill. If any of you have seen them, if you haven't, you can think of the propeller that you would see on a helicopter. It would be similar to that. So when it talks about these blades turning in the wind, half lost, we have this creepy and anxiety-inducing image, right? If you've seen horror movies and you see things slowly turning on their own with no one being there to move them, that's the kind of mood that Dante is trying to place us in. So again, we continue to see things in hell, but now they're not as clear as before. So in looking at our description of this ninth circle, we're at the very depths of hell, where we see this complete and utter mockery and twisting of the glory of heaven, and also that it's a place that is unclear and mysterious. We also begin to see some descriptions of Lucifer, so we know that he is the king of hell, and also we can gather that he's extremely large, because remember, Dante is looking out through the mist and he sees this figure almost like a mill. And remember what Virgil commanded him: look and see if you can make him out in the distance. So we know that this structure that Dante sees is Lucifer himself. We then see the effects of this image on Dante. So when he begins to see what he sees, and when the wind begins to pick up in this lowest circle of hell, he sees no other place to hide, and instead chooses to hide behind his leader's back, behind Virgil's back, rather than standing firm on his own. And this is, again, a reflection of the fear that Dante possesses. Right? A fear that is not only present in the pilgrim, but also in the poet, because we see here in this last verse that even trying to put this moment into poetry is something that Dante is going to find very difficult. And we see in this next tercet that even continues to produce fear in him, even after he has long finished his journey. And we begin to see why, in addition to the wind of hell, Dante feels so terrified, and that is because he looks at these shades, or these souls condemned to this ninth circle of hell, and he sees that they are wholly covered by ice. And this is really interesting because more often than not, when we see hell portrayed in the media, and I think actually with the exception of Lucifer, the series here, which does a good job in picking up on Dante's vision of this depth of hell, usually we think of fire and extreme heat. But here, the lowest circle of hell is described as somewhere that's extremely cold, covered in ice. It's dark, misty, unclear to see. And he also continues to use simile to describe what these shades look like. So they're covered in ice, and when he turns to look down at them, he sees that they're placed like straw in a glass, or you could think of the stems of flowers in a vase. Some are going left, right, up, down. There's no order to the way that they are. And here when we say that they're lying prone, meaning that they are lying on the ground. We also see that some, rather than being horizontal then, are vertically stuck in this ice. Some of them with their head up facing towards Dante and Virgil, some with their head facing down, so their feet are up and their faces then are trapped in this ice. We also see that some are bent almost like a bow, so bow for archery then, right? Their feet are bent towards their face, so these are completely uncomfortable positions to be stuck in, and this is part of their punishment. Continuing then our description of the ninth circle of hell, we see that their punishment is to be covered wholly and completely in ice. And remember, we said their punishment is ironic. So think about the sin that traps them there. They are guilty of treachery or betrayal. So just as they were cold and unfeeling towards the people who they misused, they're also trapped then in that same cold and icy environment now in hell. We also continue to see this description of Lucifer, but here we see it more in an unconscious sense, because it's not that we're getting a full image of Lucifer, but rather we're looking at his effect on Dante, and even just the unclear image of him is enough to send Dante running behind Virgil. Now is when we get to see this clear discussion of Lucifer, and here we see him being referenced to the way that he was when he was first created. So for those who are not familiar, either with the biblical story of Lucifer or with the story portrayed in the show, which on the whole is kind of close to the biblical account. We see that Lucifer was once an angel in heaven, now one of the highest angels of God, and he chooses to rebel against God. He believes that he should be the one in power and in control. And as a result of him failing in this rebellion, he is condemned to hell, and he then becomes a figure who is no longer beautiful, but terrifying and grotesque. And so here we see that Virgil then is going to continue to talk to Dante about Lucifer and is going to describe him to him. But we first see that Virgil moves away from Dante, and so he's going to force him to come face to face with Lucifer, or who is referred to as Dis by Dante. And Virgil also gives him some advice. Here you need to arm yourself. So when we talk about arming yourself, this gives us an image of battle or warfare. So a warning to Dante that fear and cowardice that you've been clinging to throughout our journey, you need to arm yourself now instead with fortitude or with courage. And Virgil is saying this because we are finally in the deepest, darkest depth of hell. So this is the place where we most need to be courageous. But we see even in the very same verse that Dante is not able to do this. Immediately he says how chilled and faint he felt. Remember, he's already fainted twice so far in our reading of the Inferno, so it would make sense that now standing in front of the king of hell, he would definitely feel fear. He even begins from the perspective of Dante the poet to say that even now, in retrospect, reader, I can't write for you how terrifying this was for me. Words will not suffice. And this line itself is very interesting because remember when we discussed Beatrice, Dante's courtly love, and he writes about her in these series of love poems in La Vita Nuova. And the very last thing he says is that he has this vision where he finally understands that words will not suffice in describing the beauty of Beatrice. And here we see the same kind of thing being repeated here. So although Dante is a wonder with words, at times emotion becomes so overwhelming for him that it takes these words away from him. Discussing then that ninth circle, we see it's a place filled with immense fear, and that we, just as Dante, have a greater need to be cautious, particularly when we come face to face with Lucifer. Speaking of Lucifer, we begin to see some of his background, right? So for those who are familiar with the Bible or with backstories on Lucifer, we have references to what he was like before the fall, that he was someone of great beauty, whose sin, whose rebellion caused him to now be a creature of wickedness. Then we come to the final few lines for today. And we see that looking upon Lucifer creates in this feeling in Dante that he is neither dead nor alive, almost kind of being described like a zombie, in fact. And this is the impact that coming even this close to Lucifer has on him, that he is denuded or stripped of both death and life, and he's in this weird place of being in between. So as Virgil continues to talk about Lucifer, this is the impact it has on Dante. And this is interesting because this is the first time he begins to feel this way in our reading of the Inferno. So he's not fainting, so mimicking death, nor is he able to stand firm, this image of life. He's in this spot that's in between. And we're going to look in the next video about how Dante's disposition or his presence in front of Lucifer is going to change the closer he gets to him. So then we see that coming even this close to Lucifer has this changing effect on Dante, one we haven't seen before. We also see this great need for caution, that Virgil is warning Dante that now more than ever, he needs to be someone of courage. That's it then for video number 12. In video number 13, we'll finish up Canto 34, coming face to face with Lucifer and the souls that are unfortunate enough to find themselves being punished directly by him. So make sure that you go ahead and download worksheet number 13 before you watch. Thanks for checking out this video, and see you next time.